Hi there. Hello, Steve Kaufman. You know, you get that double hello from me because I have to turn on my other recording setup for the podcast. Today I want to talk a little bit about a man by the name of Daniel Tammet. And on my blog I will put a link to an interview that he has done in German, another one he's done in English. He also has a website. He is a savant. In other words, he is apparently one of 50 people in the world who have a certain set of unique capabilities. He is able to calculate pi. You know, we all had to, in our maths at school, pi was 2 point, I don't know what it is. But he can remember that down to thousands of points. He can calculate in his mind. He can divide 3 by 54 and get it correct down to 100 or 200 points behind the decimal. I mean, he's an amazing brain. And he can learn a language in a week. And so in this particular interview, one of the interviews with a German television station, he speaks in German, and apparently he had a teacher there, and he just learned German for a week, and he speaks it phenomenally. And he has a language learning system and so forth. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about this issue. And I was so inspired by it that I went out and I bought his book, which is a bestseller here, Embracing the Wide Sky by Daniel Tammet. And I've read bits and pieces of it. And it is amazing. I mean, it shows us the potential of our brain. If our brain were wired just a little bit differently, we would be more like him, maybe. And he claims that we can all do much better than we do in terms of using our brain. And perhaps that's true. But I sort of focused on the things that he had to say about language learning, and I want to talk a little bit about them here. The first thing that he said, which I firmly believe, is that the brain is a learning machine. It cannot help but learn. And this was a major theme of Manfred Spitzer in his book Lernen, Gehirnforschung, brain research and the School of Life. Our brains will learn. So we got to make sure that we help them learn and don't overcomplicate the teaching. Let the brains learn. So I certainly agreed with that. And he also makes the point that once we've learned something and we learn it and store it in different parts of the brain, that helps us learn other things. If we learn the word for dog, he makes the example, if we learn the word for dog or for cat, it'll be easier then to learn, the word for another animal. The concept of a four-legged animal now, we're sort of building on the knowledge that we already have. And I think that's very important. I notice it all the time. When you start a new language, the more you know, the more things you've managed to puzzle through, the easier it is to add more things to your knowledge base. If you know nothing, everything is confusing. And the brain, I believe, sort of picks out those things that are easiest for you to learn, starts to put those pieces of the puzzle together, and then it becomes easier to learn other things. And it's futile to try to force yourself to learn things that are more difficult before you've had some of the other pieces put together for you. Daniel Tammet also stresses the importance of emotion. If you can be emotionally involved with what you're learning about, it's very positive. It sends positive chemicals charging around in your brain. I mean, I'm not a scientist. Motivation is extremely important. He doesn't talk so much about attentiveness, but it's something that I believe in. It's something that Manfred Spitzer mentions. It's something that we've tried to build into our learning methodology. In other words, it's not just that you have interesting content to learn from. It's not just that you're motivated to learn, but you also need to do things to make your brain a little more attentive. Now, for Daniel Tammet, that's not an issue because he just vacuum cleans all this information and he's able to get at it and retrieve it. Whereas most of us absorb all this information and we've listened to hours of this language, we've read it, and we can't find the words. They're in our brain somewhere. We can't sort of retrieve them. And I didn't see anything in his book that suggested that he had some easy answers as to how we could improve our ability to retrieve information that we certainly have absorbed. He has some things that I find difficult to accept. He sort of says it helps him because he remembers numbers based on associating them with color and stuff like that. I can't do that. Maybe some people can. And he identifies certain sounds, sounds that begin with KR are all long or short, or he identifies the fact that there is an identification between what a word sounds like and what it means, and that he claims that can help us. My feeling is that if that helps us at all, it's happening subconsciously. I've never been consciously aware of remembering a word because it sounded like what I thought that, meaning should sound like. So I didn't really buy that concept, but for those people who are helped by it, that's fine. He makes the point that a lot of the difficulty, he says, and I firmly agree with this, he says that this whole critical period in terms of language learning really only applies to the first language, and it doesn't apply to a second language. And what happens is that the first language gets kind of locked into your brain, and it then becomes a filter, and it warps your attempts to learn other languages. So you tend to pronounce the second language in a way that is corrupted by your first language. You tend to use expressions from your first language. So to that extent, having, perhaps during your critical period as a child, you've fixed on certain patterns, and therefore that influences your perception of the second language. So that's true. And that's why it's so important to leave your first language behind. I refer to my first language only in dictionaries. I like to see the new meaning quickly in my own language, even though I know that that meaning is very incomplete and that I will get a better and better sense of the meaning of that word as I see it in more and more context, but I like that. But after that, I don't like to hear English on audio recordings. I want to get away from my native language. I want to get away from my native culture. I want to try to project myself and imagine myself as Russian, Chinese, Japanese, French, whatever language I'm into. The other thing that, he says he can learn a language in a week. I don't know how it's possible to do that. The big thing, and here he agrees, he makes the point that, which I have always said, this whole myth that if you have 1,000 words, you can communicate in a language. Yeah, and he demonstrates how, in fact, those very common words really don't get you the meaning. In other words, all the meaning is in the 20% less frequent words. I, you, he, go, that, there, then, in, out, from, to, by, whatever. That's not going to get you the meaning. You need a lot of words. I'm experiencing this now in Russian. I have spent so much time on Russian. I have listened to thousands of hours of Russian. I've read lots of Russian. I have saved, 20,000 links in Link. Theoretically, I know 45,000 words. And as I read stuff, there's still key words that I don't understand. And for me, the biggest challenge is to get to where some of these, the key word that keeps on showing up, that this is the subject of this article or this point in the novel, I'm missing it. And so there are just a lot of words. I don't know how a person can even be exposed to all the words he needs to know in 1 week, let alone remember them, let alone produce them. I can't. This whole business of producing, which is another subject that I should get into, even in terms of getting things right grammatically, initially I couldn't understand the grammatical explanations in Russian. I now understand them. I now am able to relate them to things that I'm used to seeing in Russian. I even now know that this is the dative, this is the genitive, this is the instrumental, singular, plural, feminine, masculine, whatever. But to produce it, it's still very, very difficult. Doesn't matter how often I read the explanation, how often I look at the table, and I save them now in Link, and that's helping me, and I tag them, and I review them. But when I go to speak, to try to actually get the instrumental, whether it's a oo or a whatever it might be, get the right ending, is very, very difficult. So unless you're Daniel Tammet, where everything you absorb into your brain, all the input you get, is available to you because you've got this tremendous control of what's going on in your brain, I don't think 1 week is feasible. And I think you're stuck with a longer process. And the key thing is to make it continually enjoyable. And that, I must admit, my Russian learning remains tremendously enjoyable. I'm very satisfied with the progress I've made, even though it's taken me almost 3 years, where Daniel Tammet does it in 1 week. So go and see his website.